Good morning. I'm here in conversation with our two speakers of last night at the launch of the Tata Sustainability Month. Mander, social activist, author, former bureaucrat, and conscience keeper. Harsh, thank you very much for being here. And Jeremy Oppenheim. Jeremy is based out of the UK, very kindly agreed to come and speak with us at the launch of our Tata Sustainability Month. Thank you both of you for joining me in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to this. Harsh, let me come to you first. Especially post December 2016, a lot of the conversation around the world has been on climate change. It's on carbon. Somewhere along the way, there seems to be a perception that some of the real conversations around poverty, around marginalization, are actually getting marginalized. Do you think that is indeed the case? Do you think there's a relationship between climate change and poverty?
The people who will be worst hit by climate change are the poorest in terms of survival and livelihoods and so on. I think the problem has been that these two conversations tend to happen in silos and not with each other. In India in particular, the environmental movement has tended to be middle class and somewhat elite in its concerns over time. And sometimes even the way the issues are placed, tiger versus the tribal communities living in forests, is a classic example. And it almost seems, and even myself, if you place it that way, then I have to stand in defense of the tribal communities who are getting displaced from forests. But if you think hard, actually tribal communities and tigers have lived sustainably in harmony for generations and centuries. And it is not as if the survival of one has to be at the cost or a trade-off with the other. I say the peoples of every country in the world in the 21st century have to make two important decisions, not governments but people, and those will determine the future of humankind. One of them is how we'll deal with inequality, and the second is how we deal with difference. The other part about difference, I think, is important because increasingly, relatively homogenized countries in Europe, etc., are having populations who look different, who worship differently, who eat differently, who dress differently, and there's an anxiety. You're seeing these two issues playing out, and I think that we need to have people in every country have to reflect hard about the kinds of societies they want to have.
Jeremy, how do you see this, especially from where you live in London and so on? Is this sort of a conversation that is also happening separately out there, and should that be how it should be?
Look, I think it is still hard to get people to have an integrated conversation about the kind of societies that we want to build, and what that therefore means on social policy, on immigration in Europe at the moment, obviously, as a huge issue, on the environment, and there is a tendency, right, and it's the simplistic approach that people will take to kind of break these different topics into their component parts and look for, if you will, trade-offs, rather than looking at these as at the opportunity to, if you will, find integrated solutions. And I think what we know is that there are wonderfully integrated solutions. And to take one that's, I know, relevant here in India, the opportunities that come out of distributed solar power, right, to deliver better outcomes for villages that are off the grid and that have never had proper access to modern energy services, right, and for that to then feed into the educational possibilities for not just all kids, but maybe in particular for girls, right, for how that feeds into cleaning up water supply at the local level. I mean, all of these things I think can be transformative if thought through on an integrated basis.
We're talking a great deal about sanitation, and it seems to most people to be a technical challenge.
Sure.
But if you have a conversation on sanitation without recognizing caste, then you're missing the point.
Right.
Now, but we might be creating, we're saying they're going to build toilets in every school, and it seems a wonderful idea. I mean, to have toilets in schools, girls will be able to stay in school longer. But it terrifies me because the question really is who's going to clean those toilets, and almost, without doubt, it's going to be Dalit children who are going to be forced to clean toilets, largely Dalit girls, in the same schools. So to have a conversation on who's going to, even at the larger level, you have sewer systems. I've been working a lot with sewer workers, and to have a situation in which human beings still have to get into. So you have you build a sanitation system. We don't want people to defecate in the open. But when you're building a sanitation system where the human waste is going into places which still have to be cleaned manually by human beings getting into the excreta up to their neck and sometimes dying inside sewer machines, I think the whole complication of locating these conversations both in caste and in inequality. I mean, you have large slum populations who are not connected with, they're considered illegal populations, they're not connected with pipe water supply and sanitation, and therefore it's not an the environmental challenge is really one of inequality, both class and caste. And so I think that how closely enmeshed these questions are, I'm not even sure we realize when we have these conversations separately.
Yeah. Jeremy, you work a lot on energy, and I think one of the big discussions, even in Paris, obviously was about the carbon budget and mitigation and so on and so forth. Arguments that that countries like India have been putting up is that human development for us is important. Energy is very much a component of human development, and for us, we can only deliver energy in the foreseeable future using fossil fuel. So it's almost as if there's a discussion on, is it energy or is it human development? You're asking us to choose, and we choose human development.
It's a bit of a leading question, Shankar, because as you know, my personal view is that we have many ways of improving the supply of modern energy services. The question is, what do we do now, right? And where should coal be in the mix in India's economic strategy, right? And I would argue that, and I think some of this is already beginning to play out, that what one would hope to see from the Indian government and from project developers is the following. First, a much more significant growth in non-coal sources of power. And I think we're seeing that. Obviously, the 100 gigawatt program and solar mission, fantastic. Second, when coal is used, make sure that it's used in the most efficient plants. There's a huge difference between a subcritical and an ultra-supercritical coal-fired power plant, and they're not trivial in the great scheme of things. So that's number two. Number three, we can do so much more on energy efficiency. As you pointed out, this is a heritage platinum building. Right? If we could get the energy efficiency story right, then across India over the next 15 to 20 years, we could save ourselves over 100 new power stations. Fourth, let's make sure that we don't forget that there's a challenge around the grid here in India, where something between 20 and 30% of the power that gets generated gets lost, right? Now that's unacceptable. And what we should be doing is tackling some of those kind of very simple opportunities, right? in a much more disciplined, systematic way over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think there's a huge opportunity for the Tata Group.
Harsh, a similar sort of question to you. I mean, it's, in fact, in India, one would argue the reverse is happening, that we are we doing enough about climate change? Or are we just saying, we have this problem and we don't need to, we first have to solve the development problem before we do that, and we end up actually doing neither. So I'm just wondering, how do you, if you were to allocate resources, what would be your suggestion or recommendation?
Getting the mix extraordinarily wrong in both ways, because in the argument that development first, we're getting confused about what development constitutes and whose development. So I've served in forested tribal areas which have the misfortune that the tribal communities are sitting on some of the best coal resources. Going back after 20 years, and I see what's happening to those communities. So you're having huge power plants and generation and development is happening. But the impoverishment of those local communities is so savage, actually, and so extreme, that I think that the conversation is again about a very unequal development that is being pursued. And disadvantaged communities are bearing the cost both of our failures in terms of the nature of development and in the consequences of, because when those forests have been destroyed in these areas, the people whose lives are going to be most affected or already are affected, in a drought situation, for instance, that we're seeing now, where water tables are falling and so on. The consequences are also borne by the poor. So I think it's a double whammy, and so when we're saying development first, we're really talking about development or a better life for the social class that you and I belong to. But the poor are bearing the consequences of both. And I think that has to be seen much more clearly.
Sustainability debate sometimes in India focuses on the social, and in the West focuses the environmental.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
obviously there are social challenges in the West, just as Harsh talked about some of the
Mm-hmm.
environmental
Mm-hmm.
challenges here. So how do you see this in the West? What are the kinds of social issues that are sort of companies are sort of facing and dealing with and sort of encountering?
Right.
Obviously it'll be very qualitatively very different from, say, India. But what are the kinds of issues that they're grappling with?
So, look, I think they're grappling with some domestic issues and some, in the sense, international issues,
Mhm.
even if their company's located in Europe. So domestically, I think there are two main issues that are really at the heart of the social conversation. One is gender, right?
Mhm.
I mean, we do not yet have in the UK, let alone in the rest of Europe, a properly, if you will, kind of gender neutral workplace, right? We have not got there in terms of pay, in terms of conditions, in terms of expectations, in terms of let alone in the boardroom,
Mhm.
right? We're miles away, right?
Mhm.
So I think figuring out how we, ensure that changes, and it changes in a efficient, coherent way is something that's on a lot of people's minds.
Mhm.
Now that may seem quite parochial, but nonetheless, I think there's some
Sure.
very critical issues that play out everywhere in the world. A second big issue, which you may not regard, I don't know if it's a social issue, but it's definitely
Mhm.
on the agenda, is this kind of very deep question of, can we trust companies
Mhm.
nowadays, right?
Mhm.
And the question of trust, and I think it relates to the issues, Harsh, that you've been raising in different ways, that it goes from, are companies paying their taxes,
Mhm.
right, or not, right? And it somehow seems like lots of them are
Not.
able to get around it, right, in today's world. Remind me one more time why the CEO is paid what the CEO is paid. It can't be that they really need $20 million a year or whatever. And it's not. I think people actually, interestingly, they differentiate between the entrepreneurs that have really created something new and are therefore the wealth creators, and the guys that come in to be the CEOs and are presiding, if you will, over a company that someone else. So I think there's still actually quite a high level of comfort that if you've been, you're the next Bill Gates and you've created, incredible value across the world. I think there's real issues around, at the end of the day, is this system in the UK, in Europe, just as in India, who's it really set up for, right? And, how has the interplay between technology and globalization and digitization and all the rest of it, how is that really feeding into building a society in which everybody can participate in the economic opportunity and the productivity and the new technology? Or are we finding ourselves in a world in which actually the gap between those that have and those that don't is getting bigger, and that certainly in Europe and the States, this notion of a middle class that is shrinking and that is challenged. And of course there's a temptation to say it's all about globalization. It's a much, much more complex phenomenon than all of that. But companies, I think, are expected, the leading companies, to be able to not just talk about the problem. We all do a lot of admiring the problem, right? But to describe what specifically they're going to do to be part of the solution.
Harsh, to you, I mean, you did say, and I think you also give us examples of how the poor actually bear the brunt of some of the environmental degradation, forests and tigers and so on. So
and cities and slums.
And cities and slums, right? So from the viewpoint of the poor, and if you were again just to make this artificial dichotomy between social and environmental, what would be the kind of environmental issues that you think are the big ones that really impact the lives of the poor?
Actually, I was talking last evening about the drought, and I think we don't realize that drought is not, what we're facing today, what rural India is facing today, is the consequences not just of the failure of monsoons and the rains, but that it is superimposed on enormous agrarian distress, which is endemic and going on, which is a whole set of questions, but also an agroecological disaster, which we are sitting on in the countryside. I was in Bundelkhand, and they're saying they're just digging wells deeper and deeper. So you used to get water at 40 feet, now you're going down to 80 feet. The tube wells are going deeper and deeper, that they are extracting far more water in the nature of the, and it's not the farmers who did it, it's collectively, we promoted technologies which require huge amounts of water, chemical fertilizers, and we've poisoned the soils, we've pushed the water table down further and further. Again, the consequences are going to be, and then you have a drought. So the impact is far more devastating. So I would really place the agroecological crisis high up, along with forests, as two big issues. But the country, but the city, the life of an urban migrant in the city, sleeping on the streets, staying in shanties, and the completely brutalized life where we have no access to waste management, clean water supply, sanitation, what happens to people's excreta and waste and so on. I think again the consequences in the city, what we are doing is we're pushing, again we built our gated colonies, and we have beautiful lifestyles. Everything else, government schools don't function, so we have our own private schools, our private hospitals, we have our private security. Now the air is polluted, so we have machines which you can put in and clean up your air for you. The electricity doesn't work, so we have our own electrical systems. And I think all of those failures, both socially and environmentally, have to be borne by the people who work the city. So I think those are the concerns.
Right. Okay, thank you both.